have the pleasure of introducing our special guests. Bruce Burris, whose exhibition, A Shrine for a Shrine, has just opened here at the Schneider Museum of Art. Bruce will be joined by Julia Bradshaw and Phillip March Jones, who I will introduce in a moment. Our featured artist, Bruce Burris, has exhibited throughout the US, including the Portland2016 Biennial, curated by Michelle Grabner, and most recently with solo exhibitions at March and Summertime Gallery in New York, New York, which was written up in the May 2021 Art Forum issue, as well as also A.L.S.O, an acronym for the collaborative efforts of Allegra La Viola's Sargent's Daughters Gallery, and Scott Ogden of Shrine Gallery, both in New York, which was in partnership with Institute 193, 1B. Burris has been awarded numerous fellowships, including the Pollock-Krasner Foundation, the Hallie Ford Foundation, the Kentucky State Arts Council, Al Smith Fellowship, the Delaware State Arts Council, and the NEA-SAF. His work is included in numerous public, private, and collections, including University of Kentucky Art Museum, the Hallie Ford Museum of Art, and many more. Burris attended the San Francisco Art Institute and is represented by March Gallery in New York, New York. Burris has worked and collaborated with artists who are neurodiverse for 45 years and has served as founder, director, owner of a number of agencies, programs, noted for crafting innovative supports, which enable people to assume roles and significance and their community via participation in the arts. Burris has curated a group exhibition of self-taught neurodiverse artists for our Tree Haven Gallery, titled We Take the Long Way, to be on view simultaneously along his solo exhibition with us. Joining Bruce today is Julia Bradshaw, an associate professor at Oregon State University, where she teaches photography and video art. She is a curator, writer, and artist who in 2020 was awarded an individual artist fellowship by the Oregon Arts Commission. Bradshaw's video art and photography projects have been shown throughout the US, Guatemala, the Netherlands, Poland, and Germany. Phillip March Jones is an artist, writer, and curator based in New York, New York. In 2009, Jones founded Institute 193, a nonprofit contemporary art space and publisher in Lexington, Kentucky. He later served as the inaugural director of Souls Grown Deep Foundation in Atlanta, and as director of the Galerie Christian Burst in New York and Paris, as well as the Andrew Edlin Gallery in New York. Jones recently serves as Institute 193's curator at large and oversees Institute 193 1B, a project space in Manhattan's East Village that organizes collaborative exhibitions with cultural institutions from the Southern United States. Jones's photography and writings have been published by Jargon Society, Vanderbilt University Press, Dust to Digital, excuse me, and Poem 88, among others. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Burris, Julia Bradshaw, and Phillip March Jones. Just to start, maybe starting with Phillip, how do you know Bruce? What is the relationship?
Well, sometime around 2007, my brother and I started sort of an experimental art shop in Lexington, Kentucky, in an old shotgun house. And the idea was that we would take artists, writers, musicians, etc., from the Southern United States and put them in this kind of 3D collage of things. We had exhibitions, kind of happenings, readings, concerts, etc. But we really didn't know what we were doing. And one day Bruce wandered in. At the time he was working at Latitude Artist Community, a program he'd founded, and sort of liked what was happening and suggested that perhaps we could do some things together, and indeed we did. And I'll talk more about that later, but basically Bruce sort of walked into my life and haven't been able to shake him since.
Thank you, Phillip. And Julia, would you like to introduce to us why are you here today joining us with Bruce's talk?
Yeah, hello everybody. I live in Corvallis, Oregon, and Bruce lives in Corvallis, Oregon. And I met Bruce in 2013, and I think Phillip's right, you can't shake Bruce, right? And we've been working on projects together as, since then, and supporting each other. And I'm going to talk about that a little in my talk.
Sure. And Bruce, would you like to add anything to your relationships with Julia and Philip?
Well, they've both been vital in a very wonderful thing that I do is bringing attention, sort of in a public way to the amazing artists I get to work with every day. And they both have helped me, in that quest. That's a huge one. It's a heavy lift that I can't really do myself. Now I had my own career and stuff like that going for quite a long time, but both Philip, I hadn't been practicing for about a decade until I ran into Philip. I lived in Lexington, Kentucky. I lived in Kentucky for about 20 years. And, after a while there, I was just like, oh my God, why don't I just work on some other things? And then Philip has been working with me since then. Now, Julia, very, very much the same thing in trying to get something started here in Corvallis. And also, Julia and I worked in a long time together for quite some time, trying to establish a space where we could get art and objects to by artists who are neurodiverse and so forth. And it was, I think, you can tell me if I'm wrong, of course, but I think it was quite a long time before Julia even realized that I was a practicing artist. Is that right, Julia? And at that point, I think she was surprised, and she really helped launch me regionally with an exhibit at Oregon State University, which was a big deal for me, and it really sort of helped get me in a good slipstream where people were also coming to me with information. I didn't have to scramble so hard for every little bit. So that's been incredibly helpful. So stories are very similar, I think, you and Philip.
Thank you, Bruce. So what we have today is a couple of PowerPoints, and we'll start with something that Julia has put together for us.
Okay, hello, everybody. Probably most of you have not seen the show yet. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bruce's programming in a broader sense, and then talk about one piece of art a little bit closer, and hopefully that will work for you today. So if you can see my screen, that's great. So I'm going to encourage you to read the articles in the catalogue by Bean Gilsdorf and Patrick Collier, and perhaps that can be linked to in the chat somewhere, as they articulate very well the complex cacophony of voices embedded in Bruce's artwork. When you look at these artworks, you sometimes think, what side is Bruce on? Because there are so many diverse voices. I don't think it's important to know which side Bruce is on, but I do know at this time, having anyone explaining, whether in art or in writing or in general conversation, that there is more than one side in any issue is important, and that we need empathy and listening skills and humor and research to tackle those issues. I'm going to talk more in depth about one of his personal artworks later, but first I want to talk about Bruce's broader-based art practices, which is an equally important part of his practice. He's got four main strands to his art practice: his personal artworks, which are on display at the museum in Ashland, his collaborative works with neurodiverse artists, his activities creating exhibition opportunities for everybody, and his performance happenings, which he conducts through L&F projects. And it's through these happenings that I first met Bruce. I was also a newcomer to Corvallis, and in December 2013, I noticed a classified advertisement in Craigslist seeking people to read poetry to ferns for an honorarium of $50. This piqued my interest, not as a poet, I am not that, but as someone who wants to explore the activities of people making things happen outside of the mainstream. So I kept looking and was pleased to see a later classified advertisement inviting people to the reading. I went to a forest to listen to the poetry of Eric Dickey, Jenna Sobida, and Evelyn Itzerda, as they read poems to ferns as part of one of Bruce's projects. I think at this event, there were 2 listeners, myself and one other person. And it was a bitter cold day and my dog objected to standing still and we soon left. So why was I there? I was looking for the interesting, the idiosyncratic, and the people who are trying to create spaces for thinking about art and thinking about issues in this town outside of the traditional institutional art spaces. I wanted to meet people who wanted to acknowledge and pay attention to a plant that may be unused to such attention. A concentration of effort, by planning events such as Some Poems for Ferns, Bruce brought together people from diverse backgrounds and interests to create a happening in a space where poetry is not typically read aloud. This was not Bruce's first project. Bruce has been creating these activities and actions for over 2 decades, putting in classified advertisements in newspapers, then Craigslist or now Facebook, creating a call for interest and then arranging the event. For example, San Francisco poet Clip Schutz came to Corvallis and Bruce organized a reading on a downtown circular bus that was open to anyone to attend who was also riding that bus. Another of those events took place outside the Greyhound bus station. And then there was a tree reading by Dan Raphael in a performance when he read from an Oregon Wilderness newsletter from 1976. And if any of you have read information from 30, 40 years ago, you know it's sometimes still relevant today and you think, why wasn't it acted on then? So maybe it was important to draw attention to that particular newsletter. In creating all of these events, and there have been, I don't know how many, he creates intimate artist-driven projects that take place outside of traditional arts programming. And in meeting Bruce through this manner, I found an arts instigator and a collaborator in making. Bruce also creates opportunities for people who've traditionally been left out of institutional arts opportunities. It is no surprise to me that his exhibition in Ashland includes his artworks on equal footing with the artworks of neurodiverse people who've been making art up and down the I-5 corridor. He has selected artists that make work in equal intensity, motivation, and passion. It is also no surprise to me that Bruce knows who is making art up and down the I-5 corridor, regardless of their background. Bruce Burris has been a nationwide leader in the field of arts and disability for over 35 years. He is constantly making opportunities for the people in his programs in creative ways. For example, in Corvallis, he raised money for his arts programming by running a coffee stand at the farmers market. This provided both employment for clients in his programs, but also promoted the artwork of people taking part in his programming. Participants in his programs have a strong advocate in Bruce. He runs a gallery at CEI Artworks, where he puts on exhibitions by people in his programs, as well as by artists who have more formal art backgrounds. He's now running programs at Living Studios in Corvallis. Through Artwork CEI and Outpost 1000, he has facilitated Patrick Hackelman's representation by Gallery Christian Burst in New York, as well as Patrick's participation in the Outsider Art Fair in New York. An installation of Matt Conklin's Cardboard Towers was exhibited in complement to Bruce's work at C3 Initiative for Portland-2016, a biennial of contemporary art. Participants in his programs have exhibited their work at Oregon State University, Corvallis Art Center, and now at the Schneider Museum of Art. He also exhibits the work of professional artists in the same space, giving participants in his programs the opportunity to interact and respond to the art on view, in addition to meeting the artists if they wish. It is important for Bruce that the artworks of the people in his programs are seen in the same venues as the artworks of professional artists for whom he has also created exhibition opportunities. I could say more about Bruce's programs, and I hope I have piqued your interest so you can address a question more directly to Bruce. But now I want to talk to his artworks. In Being Gilsdorf's wrote, as Bean Gilsdorf wrote in her essay, overall the effect is a cacophony of voices that phase in and out of harmony with each other, cooperating, disagreeing, clamoring to be heard. I'm going to take you for a brief tour of this piece, Super Regional, so you can get a sense of the cacophony of voices. So let's first take a look at the piece, and my dog is going to give you some scale. Notice the shape of the painting. What does the non-rectangular shape imply? I'm going to get to that. You will notice that elements seem to protrude from the painting. This is not a flat two-dimensional piece. And one corner of the painting is propped up by a stick, which is both pathetic, but also indicative of the tenuous web of voices inside the painting. And if you go to the museum, you will see he's got pieces, I think, on view of as kind of what's it called, protest signs on sticks, and the sticks are all broken. So if you actually wanted to carry one, you would imagine having to drag these protest signs along the street. Protest, you try, but they don't always succeed. So let's go in a little deeper into this picture. And I've got a little video, and I'm going to talk over this and see if it gives you some sense of what it's like to wander around one of his paintings. So starting here in the middle of the painting, we're going to see two people with signs, protest signs, which come up often in Bruce's pieces. We've got the people who are sitting in the tree, and they've got their sign saying, "Trees are not for profit." And they proudly have that dangling from the tree. But just below that, there's another sign saying, "Tree sitters go to hell." And on the right, there's a sign saying, "Trees property of Seneca Jones Timber Company." So a lot of competing signs. And so we can already see there's 2 points of view. And then this is probably my favorite piece, and it's a recurring motive in some of Bruce's work, this big boot, lumberjack boot, but the spikes have glitter on them, or a sequence, they're very shiny. And then the words say, "Ha." It is a very heavy truth. And so there's humor there. And then over to the left, we have another piece that says, with a sign going, I'm going to try, it's wandered away from me, "Aha," to the brain. So I'm finding humor, and I'm also finding lots of materials. At the top of the piece, there's a reference to Times, New York Times, and that's because a lot of the information we're getting about the lumber industry comes from the media, regardless of what your point of view is. And then we have this kind of family tree of people on the right-hand side, who I'm not really entirely certain what their relationship is to each other than the fact that it looks like a tree shape that somebody might create. And then the sign, "Aha, tree, you are but a stump," because trees do end up in stumps in these managed forests. We have a reference to climate change through the polar bear, which could be at once be seen as a trite symbol. Bruce uses information that comes from magazines. He's also, you're seeing, I hope, as I wander through here, the type of materials he's using, sort of like crocheted piece that's three-dimensional, that pulls out from the piece. And then we have this person, veterinarian, with her dogs, and trying to figure out why that is connected to the general overall theme of the timber industry. I'm going to leave that up to you. So when Bruce made this piece, he was actually living in Corvallis. We have a strong forestry program at the university. And we also have a lot of people here who I would consider environmentalists. At the same time, Bruce was working in Lebanon, and Lebanon is a city where the logging industry has not been economically sound in the last couple of decades. And so it's a sort of a more, a town that seems to be rather at opposing points of view. So Bruce is gathering all of that information and then just putting it all on one painting. And I hope that gives you some idea. Oh, and he collects stuff. I just have this in my collection. He found this at the record store. So maybe this record formed part of the interest into this particular piece painting. So that's where I'm going to stop my share, but hopefully I've given you some idea of what he's been doing in Corvallis, and one look at one of his paintings just a tiny bit more in depth.
Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. Bruce, would you like to respond to what Julia has shared with us?
Well, those pictures were taken a couple of years ago, and all I can tell you is this is a new hat since then, same with the shirt. So if there's any question about that. No, I don't really have anything to add, I don't think. I mean, Julia, you went way further than I ever would have gone on that, and I really do appreciate it. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Bruce. Maybe I'll share my screen and we'll share some of the current work, some work that is included in the exhibition. And we'll discuss that in a moment. Okay, here we go, Bruce. The exhibition in which we have for you a shrine for a shrine, titled after this artwork here. Would you like to talk about this?
Okay, you want me to talk about it? All right. Well, it is exactly that. A lot of it's a shrine for a shrine. You can see on the bottom collaged piece. I'm looking at one of those window. Well, first of all, I'm influenced by shrines, and in fact, Phillip, who did a book based on roadside shrines and everything, sort of got my connected brain in there with shrine stuff. I think maybe I wouldn't have really recognized that as so essential. But so this is one of those car shrines. You can see it, and it's dedicated to the Finnecums, who were a part of the Malheur occupation here in Oregon a couple of years ago, and this is overgrazing, land rights, and so forth. And it did end with, well, it hasn't ended, but it was bookended by, the shooting of Robert Finnecum and by the FBI and all the controversies around that. But that was the cause of the shrine, and so shrine for a shrine.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah. And you can see some of my regular elements in that too, boots and logging stuff and so forth. So this piece, Scott, can you remember the name of it? Oh, Ye Are One with Stoner Creek.
Yes,
and this was a piece that I had done, that I did living in central Kentucky. It's on these different sheets or whatever. And I at some point I hope to maybe continue on with this, but there's a river that flows through central Kentucky called Stoner Creek, and it's about 100 miles long. So I mean, it really flows through the center of the state in a real way. And a lot of the themes of my work, towns left high and dry by logging moving on, same with mountain mining and so forth. What happens to those communities, and how do they adapt and adjust? And to me, that this is kind of what that's about. It's a timepiece and sort of just a thing to think about when I think about these communities that are really, again, trying to pull themselves together and figure out how to continue on into, you know, the next phase. Anytime you want to step in and say something, Philip, that would be good too.
Okay, I can step in at any point. What do you want to, you sure you don't want to talk a little bit about this work, and then we can talk more generally?
Okay, so yeah, this is more, yeah, a lot of my work is general, going all over the place. But it's theme. I mean, I got my themes, but this one in particular is, again, related to the Finicums and a last cattle drive and land rights. And it is, I have it, I love, as Patrick Collier would say, I really enjoy rock operas. And so you can see that this is set on a kind of patched up stage, and it is this, the opera itself, or opry, rock opry, is it's like an homage to the influences, the way that this family has influenced the well, I'll just call it land culture. Same, kind of, but in this case, it's more specific to, Julia mentioned a town that I've been working in for a while, Lebanon, which is not far from here, which has been hit super hard by lack of, you know, the moving away from timber, lack of all those sorts of opportunities. It was such a prosperous town. I by, you know, just sort of like by accident, came across a video that was made in Lebanon by their Chamber of Commerce in around Christmas time in 1955. And it was so prosperous, kids going into the hardware store and coming out with toy tractors and all this kind of thing. And it was really heartbreaking to imagine what this town has gone through over the past 20 or 30 years in establishing itself, and people moving on, and families trying to adjust, and new industries if they're available, and so forth. So this again is another one of those pieces. Right. So again, I think more specific. This is maybe more specific to logging, and sometimes I have to look at them to figure out what was I talking about here. But you get the idea. This is probably about logging, maybe. Yeah, it is, right. And that is actually, now that I remember, that really comes back to a meeting that I had with a fellow who had really spent his entire life in this field, logging, and he was really telling some of the specific stories and meaningful experiences that he had had as a logger. It wasn't a long conversation, but that is the sort of the genesis of this particular piece. Yeah. Oh, and you can see I got some land stuff going on in there too. But yeah, there in the right-hand corner, there's some, looks like some Malheur occupation and so forth too. But I mean, these things are connected. Anyway, so yeah, thanks.
Well, maybe Bruce, I can talk about the works that you produced in 2020 that were the subject of the exhibition we did at Summertime.
Please.
And so again, my name is Phillip March Jones, and I've basically worked in the nonprofit sphere in the sort of curatorial realm, organizing various exhibitions, biennials, working for foundations, et cetera. But recently sort of changed gears, and I'm opening a commercial gallery in downtown Manhattan. And the reasons for that are diverse, but one of them has to do with representing in the sort of commercial sphere artists like Bruce, who really haven't had a meaningful presence in that way, in Bruce's case, in a long time, and trying to be a real advocate at art fairs, kind of in the storefront here in downtown Manhattan, and to the press. And the first exhibition we did with Bruce in that capacity, although this is probably I think the third solo exhibition I've organized of his work over the past decade, was about these drawings that were made in 2020. We sort of got lucky. I didn't really know how to present them on the front end, because if you kind of dig in deep, there are a lot of layers of, again, as Julia spoke to quite articulated quite well, a lot of layers of dissonance or of maybe opposing views. And especially in a place like Brooklyn or here in downtown Manhattan, some of the language might have fallen on sort of not understanding or sympathetic ears. But we did luck out and get a break with everything happening, I think, nationally. And we opened the exhibition the day before Biden and Harris were inaugurated, and only a couple of weeks after sort of nonsense at the Capitol from 2 weeks prior. So I think that everything that was in the drawings all of a sudden was made quite plain and quite real for a lot of people. And actually, in the Review and Art Forum, the writer wrote, the 14 works on view were essentially heralds announcing that our lives would be inundated with images of the vile oath keepers and their repugnant brethren. No joyful tidings here. But I do think that I think Bruce's ability to kind of layer and place all these things into a single colorful work of art. Again, we sort of got lucky with the timing. And Scott, do you have images of I can't remember how the PowerPoint goes, if there are images of that installation, but all of these, with this drawing is actually from an earlier kind of iteration, about 20 years earlier, in fact, but all the others that were made in 2020, that were all about the same size, I think presented a sort of a coherent mise en scène or sort of questioning about where we were as a country in a very general way. Can we go to the next? Okay, and these are from the Schneider. I think that so what I'm trying to do with Bruce is basically act again as a as a gallerist representing his work, which is uniquely challenging, and for a couple of reasons. The first is that most artists are primarily concerned with their own careers, as opposed to the careers of others. And again, I've worked with Bruce in a number of ways, and with artists that Bruce has then worked with in a number of ways, including people like Albert Moser or Jesse Donahue or Beverly Baker, artists who were a part of Latitude artist community that we later showed in galleries and museums in Europe and the United States. But what I've always been sort of more interested in was finding a way to get Bruce to re-engage with his own material and his own practice, because I find his sort of aesthetic and views to be essential and missing from a larger dialogue. But again, it's been this kind of 20-year negotiation of kind of coaxing artworks out of Bruce to be shown, as opposed to just advocating for others. But do you have the can we keep moving through the? I know there were images of the show we did at Shrine and some other things that I'd like for people to see.
Let's see if we can
Keep going.
Yeah, there you go. It's the next one. So this was an exhibition we organized in this sort of project space in the basement of Shrine and Sergeant's Daughters, using these paintings that become protest signs, or protest signs that become paintings. We'd shown a similar work at Institute 193 about a decade earlier, but the idea of this, again, in this kind of, I feel like protest culture has only grown in the United States, particularly with the sort of advent of the Trump era, and all of the inherent problems that go along with protests, sort of the sort of futility of, but the essential nature of it. And you have these, impossibly long sticks and poles that kind of go up and down, that are jointed and that are ultimately sort of useless, right? Like there's no way actually carry these things out into the world, but that are quite beautiful all in the same breath. Can you go to the next? And again, I feel, my involvement with the nonprofit sector, particularly organizations like Institute 193 that I founded, or like Souls Grown Deep in the Southern United States, is really finding a way to talk about very complex issues in the social justice kind of arena, but using a sort of contemporary aesthetic and kind of marrying those worlds. And I think Bruce does it quite seamlessly. And I'm excited to be working with him in this kind of new, in this sort of new capacity.
Thank you, Phil. I agree. Being a museum director, working on curatorial projects and bringing in curators, looking for diverse voices, and having to ultimately make executive decisions of what we bring in. Bruce brings in so much. We want to celebrate artists and their work, the content and meaning of their work, but also to go deep into what else the artist does and they contribute to society and a culture. We have a little bit of time left for questions. If anybody has any questions, you can type those into the chat and I will read them aloud, or you can unmute yourself and ask Bruce, Philip, or Julia directly. Let's see, we have a question from Alan Hicks. What drew you to become involved with neurodiverse and outside artists, and how have their expressions influenced your work? That's for you, Bruce.
Okay, well, certainly there are the work by those that I collaborate with here and work with are, they influence my own work greatly. Just spending so much time with this work, it's bound, that I appreciate, is bound to translate. I see threads of it in everything that I do, from one of the things using found materials and common materials and those sorts of things. I was already doing that, but it was like, as I started working with people more, I found that, a real comfort in working with found materials. Michaels, I love Michaels, and that sort of thing. I started in the field just as a person doing social work, and this was a really long time ago. I worked at a state hospital in Delaware, and I worked on a geriatric ward, as they were called at the time, and I was an attendant, as they were called at the time, and there was very little to do. And I, at the time, was exploring the arts myself in just a sort of a general beginning way, and found that there wasn't anything to do on these wards except for some, when cigarette time and medicine time. And then you'd go to the station, just like the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, exactly like it. And in between, just hours and hours of nothing to do, television, room down on either end of the hallway with a few chairs and some tables. And I started putting some on occasion. There was a fellow who found his own paper and pencil and repetitively drew pictures of a knife, a whiskey bottle, and something else. And he was always manipulating these images. And so I put some paper out, some pencils and so forth, and people used them. I was surprised by that. And I wouldn't say that it was like an art class, but I think having access to that material was important for some people. And I just kind of continued on with that. So the next job I took, maybe it was at a boys club. It was like, well, these are the different areas nobody wants to deal with. And there would be a craft room, and I'd be like, oh, what the hell? I'll give that a try with people. And that basically is kind of how I got here. I was represented for a really long time, maybe close to 20 years, by the Bronstein Key Gallery in San Francisco when I lived on the West Coast. And they introduced me to Creative Growth Arts Center and the founders of Creative Growth. Creative Growth is the first, well, it's recognized generally as the first brick and mortar program in the United States, specifically to support artists who would be considered to be neurodiverse or neurodiverse. And so that was a very exciting thing. I found like, well, this is the kind of stuff I'm doing anyway, but I see how they created sort of an institutional template for that and themselves. And so I found working in the field of developmental disabilities that there were all of these programs. They were called day programs, and they still exist. In fact, I work in one that in a building right now that is the remnants from that culture. And instead of doing nothing pretty much for the whole day, I introduced a cultural program, and that seemed to take in these places. And so there you go.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Alan. Another question in the chat from Isabel. How do you decide the media to use? Is it dependent on the message?
Maybe. Yeah, I kind of think it's a comfort for sure to talk about the things that I do with the materials that I use. But that also may be because I am, yes, I went to the Art Institute, San Francisco Art Institute for a little while, but that was well after I had already been represented by galleries and all this kind of thing. Yeah, I don't know. I forget what the question was, frankly. Where are we?
The question was, how do you decide what media to use? Is it dependent?
Right. And so I have always felt very uncomfortable with like what I consider to be like hard to use and understand artist materials, like oil paint. Are you kidding me? No. Oh, look, I'm going to be making a bronze. Or what? A screen print? Are you kidding me? No, I don't get it. I shy away. I'm scared of these things. I don't recommend those feelings, right? I wouldn't say that that's good, but then, okay, what do I have left? I still need to make things. So what's left to me? Well, look, there's Michael's and a big sheet of plastic I just found on the ground. So that's my comfort, right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question from Sherry. What first inspired you to create art the way you do? You may have touched on that with some of your earlier responses, but what first?
Yeah, that right. I think that's right. I think that was kind of like, yes, I just, I wanted to create, didn't know how, didn't feel like I knew how. What is left to me, right? So that, and it turns out what is left to me is like a whole lot. But I don't always recognize that either. I do come across it. It's like, Jesus, I wish I could. That oil paint is so luscious and delightful. If only I could, but I'm too scared. And here's your opportunity, Bruce, to learn how to do some printmaking. And it's like, yes, I would love to until I get there and just no, I should just go home. Mm-hmm. So anyway.
Thanks, Bruce. Another question which you may have already touched on. Do you pick your found materials to be specific to a piece? And how do they relate to the text they are part of?
Well, again, I mean, I feel like the found materials and stuff I get at Michael's and so forth, it just suits me as common, comfortable material. And, I think that people who have influenced my work or things that have happened which are become a part of my work are not, I mean, they themselves might be doing amazing things with materials I couldn't even imagine, but this is just a comfort for me as well.
Thank you. Any other questions from anybody? Would you like to put them in the chat or ask them aloud?
I actually have a question.
Yes, Mason.
It's nice to meet you, Bruce. I really like your art. But I did have a question on the piece, Hey Cowboy, What You Smokin' Boy? And so obviously, so it's your decorations overlaid on a mirror. And I was wondering if the title was supposed to reflect a sort of condescending tone.
Well, in certain talk is really not. It's just a part of the friendly banter.
I see.
So, but that piece, I specifically, so why I wrote that though, was because that is sort of, oh gosh, that is sort of a commemorative piece that a wonderful filmmaker, Northern California filmmaker by the name of Bruce, I can't remember, passed away. And I thought that that's what I had heard in one of his films. It turned out it wasn't, but I still thought it was a good title, so I left it.
Thanks, Bruce. Yes, we are running out of time. If there's any other questions, there's one in the chat. Difference between neurodiverse and outsider art.
I do not know.
Mhm.
I'm not, the terms in my head are getting like way mixed up. So I try to avoid them when I can, but I don't do a very good job of that.
Mm-hmm. Julia has mentioned Bruce Connor for the filmmaker.
Oh,
there you go. I love Bruce's films. Bruce Burris, Phillip March Jones, Julia Bradshaw. Any last words before we end this conversation?
I look forward to seeing the show.
Oh, you're on the next flight out, Phillip, huh?
Exactly.
thanks, everybody.
I'm also going to see the show, but I think we've only touched on like half an inch of Bruce's stuff that he does. And I have to say, he also has so many plans that actually don't come to fruition. The attempts that don't get made, and he's still trying to get made, which is a huge amount of energy that we're not seeing as well. So anyway.
I'm glad you brought that up in a way, Julia. One last thing, and that is like the essential thing that I try to do with people, and also myself, is to provide just a little bit of support. It goes a long way. You wouldn't believe it. So the folks that I work with day in and day out, it really is providing just the smallest amount of support can really help enable a person to go out and do what they want. And you mentioned E.L.F, those projects which receive very little support, and I gave up after a while. It was like I couldn't find the level of support that was a comfort to me. So that's a really good, I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you, Bruce. And with our exhibitions, artist talks, having arts writers contribute essays, we hope that it brings insight to our audiences about the work, as well as a springboard, and encourages everybody to continue to do some research on the artist and the artwork at hand. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to follow up with the museum, and we can send those questions on to Bruce. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We'll see you in the museum.